The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a dust-covered rider who didn't bother dismounting. Clay Yazzie stood in the doorway of his ranch house, squinting against the harsh Arizona sun as he took the envelope. The rider was already gone before Clay could offer water, disappearing into the heat shimmer that rose from the desert floor. Inside, the letter bore the seal of the Boston Matrimonial Agency. Clay's weathered fingers traced the wax imprint before breaking it open. The words were typed neat and proper, informing him that his request had been approved. A suitable woman had been found who met his specifications, skilled in cooking, experienced in household management, and willing to relocate to the Arizona territory. Clay folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He hadn't asked for a wife. He'd made that clear in his correspondence. What he needed was someone who could cook decent meals, keep the house from falling into complete disarray, and, most importantly, someone who wouldn't ask questions or expect anything beyond room, board, and fair wages, a useful shadow. Nothing more. 3 weeks later, in Boston. Violet Bennett sat in the cramped office of the same matrimonial agency, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. The walls were papered with advertisements for Western opportunities and brave women needed for frontier life. She'd read them all during her wait, memorizing the promises of adventure and new beginnings. Mrs. Bennett, the agency clerk said, peering at her over wire-rimmed spectacles. You understand this arrangement is unconventional? Mr. Yazzie has been quite specific. He seeks a housekeeper who can cook, not a wife in the traditional sense. Violet nodded. At 25, she was already marked as a widow, her black dress a constant reminder of a husband who'd loved cards more than he'd loved her. Thomas had left her with nothing but debts and the kind of reputation that made respectable employment impossible. She'd worked in Boston's finest restaurants, her hands creating delicate sauces and perfect pastries. But no establishment would hire a widow who'd been seen arguing with creditors on public streets. I understand perfectly, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. I need work, and I can cook. That's all that matters. The journey west took 11 days. Violet watched through the train window as civilization gradually gave way to wilderness. The verdant hills of the east faded into endless plains, then rose into mesas and canyons painted in colors she'd never imagined existed. Red rock, orange sand, purple shadows stretching across landscapes that seemed to belong to another world entirely. At the final station, a wooden platform surrounded by nothing but desert, she stood alone with her 2 worn carpet bags. The other passengers had disembarked at more promising stops. The station master, a grizzled man who smelled of tobacco and sweat, looked her up and down. You the mail-order bride for the half-breed? He asked, spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. I'm the housekeeper for Mr. Yazzie, Violet corrected, though the words felt strange on her tongue. The man snorted. Same difference. He's late, as usual. Probably forgot you were coming. Violet found a bench in the shade and waited. The heat was unlike anything she'd experienced in Boston. It pressed down from above and rose up from below, surrounding her in a furnace that made her wool dress feel like a prison. Sweat trickled down her spine, and she resisted the urge to remove her gloves. An hour passed, then 2. The station master had retreated inside, leaving her alone with the buzz of insects and the distant cry of a hawk. She was beginning to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake when she heard the creak of wagon wheels. Clay Yazzie drove a buckboard pulled by 2 sturdy horses, their coats dusty and sweat-darkened. He didn't hurry them, letting them pick their way along the rutted road at their own pace. Violet stood as he approached, smoothing her skirts and trying to look like someone worth hiring. He was not what she'd expected. The agency had mentioned his mixed heritage, but they hadn't described the way it showed in his features, the high cheekbones and bronze skin of his Apache mother, combined with the lighter eyes and broader frame that must have come from his father. He wore typical rancher's clothes, but something in the way he moved, fluid and careful, spoke of a different upbringing. Clay pulled the horses to a stop, but didn't get down from the wagon. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're smaller than I expected," he said finally. "I'm stronger than I look." Violet replied, lifting her chin. "Can you really cook?" "I trained at the Copley Hotel in Boston. I can make anything from simple stew to beef Wellington." "I don't need beef Wellington." He jerked his head toward the back of the wagon. "Get in." Violet blinked at his rudeness, but picked up her carpet bags. Clay made no move to help her, watching impassively as she struggled to lift them into the wagon bed and then climb up herself. Her dress caught on a splinter, tearing slightly, but she said nothing. The ride to the ranch took 3 hours through landscape that both terrified and fascinated her. The road, if it could be called that, wound between towering saguaro cacti and clusters of thorny ocotillo. Red dust rose in clouds behind them, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks sharp against the endless blue sky. Clay didn't speak, and Violet followed his lead. She gripped the wagon seat as they bounced over rocks and through dry creek beds, trying not to think about snakes or scorpions or the dozen other dangers the agency had warned her about. The ranch, when it finally came into view, was both better and worse than she'd imagined. The main house was solid adobe, thick-walled against the heat, with a wooden porch that provided blessed shade, but everything else spoke of neglect, fences that needed mending, a garden plot overtaken by weeds, and a general air of a place where only the most necessary work got done. Clay pulled up in front of the house and finally climbed down. He didn't offer her a hand, instead beginning to unhitch the horses with practiced efficiency. "Your room's inside, first door on the left," he said without looking at her. "Kitchen's in the back. There's a well out behind for water. Privy's that way." He gestured vaguely toward a small structure 50 yards from the house. Violet climbed down on her own, her legs shaky after the long ride. "What about rules?" Clay interrupted, finally turning to face her. His eyes were the color of sage, lighter than she'd expected against his sun-darkened skin. "You don't go in my room. Ever. You don't ask about my business or where I go. You cook 3 meals a day, breakfast at sunrise, dinner at noon, supper at dusk. You keep the house clean and the garden if you're inclined. You don't leave the ranch without telling me. And you don't bring anyone here." "I understand," Violet said quietly. "Do you?" His gaze was sharp, searching. "This isn't Boston. There's no society here, no parties, no civilization, just work and heat and dust. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away, and they won't welcome you any more than they welcome me." "I'm not looking for welcome," Violet said. "Just work." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or a moment of recognition, but it was gone before she could be sure. "Supper's at dusk," he repeated, then led the horses toward the barn, leaving her standing alone in front of the house. Violet picked up her carpet bags and stepped onto the porch. The door wasn't locked. Probably nothing out here worth stealing, she thought. Inside, the house was surprisingly cool, the thick walls keeping out the worst of the heat. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and hooks on the wall for clothes. The window looked out over the desert, endless and alien. She sat on the bed and finally allowed herself a moment of weakness. What had she done? Trading the familiar miseries of Boston for this isolation. This man who looked at her like she was just another tool for his ranch? But no. She straightened her spine and began unpacking. She'd made her choice. She'd survived Thomas's gambling, his debts, his fists when the liquor was in him. She'd survived the whispers and the shame after his death. She could survive this too. The kitchen, when she found it, was a disaster. Dirty dishes piled in the dry sink, the stove covered in grease, mouse droppings in the corners, but the bones of it were good. A solid cast-iron stove, a large table for work, shelves that could hold plenty once they were cleaned. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By the time the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink she'd never seen in Boston, Violet had transformed the kitchen. The stove gleamed black. The dishes were washed and stacked. And something that resembled supper was beginning to take shape from the meager supplies she'd found. She heard Clay's boots on the porch and ladled stew into a bowl, setting it on the table with fresh cornbread she'd managed despite the unfamiliar stove. He stopped in the doorway, looking around the clean kitchen with obvious surprise. "Sit," Violet said. "Eat while it's hot." He sat slowly, as if unsure of the protocol. When he took the first bite of stew, his eyes widened slightly. "This is good," he said, sounding almost accusatory. "I told you I could cook." She turned back to the stove, serving her own portion. When she moved to take it to her room, he spoke again. "You can eat here, at the table." They ate in silence as the desert night fell around them. Through the window, Violet could see stars beginning to appear, more stars than she'd known existed. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she shivered despite the warmth from the stove. "Gets cold at night," Clay said, noticing. "There's extra blankets in the hall closet." It was the kindest thing he'd said all day. Later, alone in her narrow bed with 3 blankets piled on top, Violet listened to the night sounds of the desert. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries lonely and wild. The wind moaned around the corners of the house, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. She pulled the blankets higher and closed her eyes, trying not to think about tomorrow, or the next day, or all the days after that. She'd wanted to survive, and here was survival. Whether it would ever be more than that remained to be seen. In his own room, Clay lay awake, troubled by something he couldn't name. The woman's cooking had been unexpected. Yes, but it was more than that. The way she'd stood up to his rudeness, the straightness of her spine despite her obvious exhaustion, the quiet dignity with which she'd eaten her meal, it all spoke of strength he hadn't anticipated. He'd wanted a shadow, someone who would blend into the background of his life without disturbing anything. But Violet Bennett, with her torn dress and determined chin, was already more substantial than that. And that, Clay thought as sleep finally claimed him, might be a problem. The first week passed in a blur of new routines and hard lessons. Violet learned that water was more precious than gold in the desert, that the well required not just strength but technique to work the pump without exhausting herself. She learned to bank the fire in the stove just right to keep embers alive through the night, saving precious matches. She learned that the wind could shift from gentle breeze to howling gale in minutes, sending dust through every crack and crevice in the house. Clay maintained his distance, leaving before dawn for his work with the cattle and returning after sunset. Their interactions were limited to meals, which he ate with focused efficiency before disappearing again. But Violet noticed things, how he always checked the horizon before entering the house, how his hand sometimes moved to his hip where a gun might rest, how he counted the horses in the corral each evening like a ritual. On her 8th day, Violet woke to find a rattlesnake coiled on the porch steps. She froze, her heart hammering as the creature lifted its head, tongue flicking out to taste the air. She'd read about rattlesnakes in the agency's preparatory pamphlet, but the reality was far more terrifying than words on paper. "Don't move." Clay's voice came from behind her, calm and steady. She hadn't heard him approach. He moved past her with fluid grace, a long stick in his hand. With one swift motion, he pinned the snake's head and flung it far into the brush. "They come for the shade," he said, turning back to her. "Check before you step out, always." That evening, he lingered after supper instead of immediately retreating to his room. "You're adjusting," he said, not quite a question. "I'm learning," Violet replied, kneading dough for tomorrow's bread. The rhythm soothed her, familiar when everything else was strange. Most women would have been on the next stage east after seeing that rattler. I'm not most women. She shaped the dough into loaves with practiced hands. Besides, the contract was clear. 6 months minimum, room and board plus wages. Clay studied her, his sage-colored eyes unreadable. "You always honor your contracts. Always." She met his gaze steadily. "Don't you?" Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, gone before she could be certain. There's a town about 15 miles north, Willow Creek. I go for supplies once a month. You can make a list if you need things. After he left, Violet realized it was the longest conversation they'd had since her arrival. The desert revealed itself to her slowly, like a cautious friend. She learned to appreciate the fierce beauty of dawn. When the mountains turned purple and gold before the heat descended, she discovered that the seemingly barren landscape was actually teeming with life. Lizards that did push-ups on the rocks, roadrunners that raced across the yard, tiny flowers that bloomed and died in a single day. She started a kitchen garden, clearing a small plot near the well where she could easily water. Clay watched from the barn as she worked, breaking the hard earth with a rusty hoe she'd found in the shed. When she looked up, he turned away. But the next morning she found the hoe sharpened and oiled, a pair of worn leather gloves placed beside it. The house began to show signs of her presence. Curtains appeared in the windows, sewn from fabric she'd brought in her carpet bags. The floors were scrubbed until the wood grain showed through years of dirt. She found wildflowers that could survive in a jar of water for a day or two, adding spots of color to the rough wooden tables. Clay said nothing about these changes, but Violet caught him looking sometimes. His expression puzzled, as if he couldn't quite understand how his space had been altered without his noticing. One evening, a sandstorm rolled across the desert like a brown wall. Violet watched it approach with growing alarm, remembering the agency's warnings about seeking shelter. She was closing shutters when Clay appeared, moving with urgent purpose. "Inside," he ordered, pushing her toward the door. "Cover your face if it gets bad." They huddled in the kitchen as the storm hit, the wind screaming like a living thing. Dust forced its way through every crack, turning the air thick and gritty. The house groaned under the assault, and Violet found herself pressing closer to Clay without conscious thought. "First storm?" he asked, his voice muffled by the bandana over his face. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The world outside had disappeared into a brown void, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were the only two people left alive. "It'll pass." His hand briefly touched her shoulder, the first deliberate contact between them. The house has weathered worse. When the storm finally moved on, leaving drifts of sand against the walls and a layer of dust on every surface, they worked together in silent cooperation to clean up. It was the first time Violet felt like they were partners rather than awkward strangers sharing a space. The next test came in the form of coyotes. Violet heard them often at night, their yipping cries carrying across the desert. But she'd never seen them close to the house. Then one morning she found them circling the chicken coop she'd restored, lean shapes with calculating eyes. Without thinking, she grabbed the broom and rushed out, shouting and waving it like a weapon. The coyotes scattered, but not far, watching her with intelligent eyes that promised they'd return. That was foolish. Clay's voice made her jump. He stood on the porch, rifle in hand. "Coyotes in a pack can be dangerous. They were after the chickens," Violet said, still breathless from adrenaline. "I couldn't just watch. Next time, fire the shotgun in the air. It's by the door." He paused, then added grudgingly, "Though you've got spirit, I'll give you that." That evening, she found him reinforcing the chicken coop, adding wire and boards to make it more secure. When she brought him water, he accepted it with a nod that felt like progress. The rhythms of ranch life began to feel natural. Violet learned to read the weather in the color of the sunrise, to gauge Clay's mood by the set of his shoulders, to find beauty in the stark landscape that had initially frightened her. She experimented with local ingredients, prickly pear fruits that made excellent jelly, mesquite pods that could be ground for flour, wild herbs that added new flavors to familiar dishes. Clay began to linger more often after meals, sometimes even offering commentary on the food. "This is different," he'd say, or "My mother used to make something similar," though he never elaborated on those rare mentions of his past. One night, Violet hummed while washing dishes, an old hymn from her childhood. She didn't realize Clay had stayed in the kitchen until his voice interrupted her. "You sing?" She flushed, embarrassed. Not well. My mother said I could carry a tune in a bucket if the bucket had a lid. It's pleasant. The admission seemed to cost him something. This place is too quiet sometimes. After that, she let herself hum more often, filling the silence with half-remembered melodies. Sometimes she caught Clay listening, his work-roughened hands still on the table, his eyes focused on something far away. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into her stay. Violet had been hauling water from the well, bucket after bucket for laundry day, when a coughing fit seized her. The dry air and dust had been irritating her throat for days, but this was worse, leaving her gasping and weak. She made it through the day's work but could barely touch her supper. Clay noticed immediately. "You're ill. Just the dust," she managed between coughs. "It'll pass." He frowned but said nothing more. That night, the coughing grew worse, keeping her awake despite her exhaustion. She muffled the sound in her pillow, not wanting to disturb Clay, but the walls were thin. In the morning, she found a bundle outside her door, dried leaves wrapped in cloth, a small jar of honey, and a note in careful handwriting. "Steep the leaves in hot water. Add honey. Apache remedy." The tea tasted bitter and strange, but it soothed her throat. By evening, the coughing had eased. When Clay came in for supper, she tried to thank him, but he waved her words away. "Can't have you dying," he said gruffly. "Good cooks are hard to find out here." But his eyes were softer than his words, and Violet felt something shift between them, subtle as a change in the wind. That night after supper, instead of retreating immediately, Clay surprised her. "The town I mentioned, Willow Creek. I'm going tomorrow for supplies. You should come." Violet looked up from the pot she was scrubbing. "I should. You need to be seen. Let people know you're here proper, working for me. Otherwise, they make up stories." His jaw tightened. "And you probably need things, female things. The general store has most supplies." It was the most consideration he'd shown for her needs, and Violet felt oddly touched. "I'd like that. Thank you. We leave at dawn. Wear something that covers your arms. Sun's brutal on the road." As he turned to go, Violet found herself asking, "Clay, why did you really advertise for a housekeeper? You seem to manage fine on your own." He paused in the doorway, his back to her. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, "A man gets tired of his own cooking, of talking to horses, of—" He stopped, shook his head. "Dawn, be ready." After he left, Violet stood in the quiet kitchen, processing this first real glimpse beneath Clay's careful armor. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkness, but the sound no longer frightened her. She was beginning to understand that survival in the desert meant more than just enduring the heat and isolation. It meant learning to see beyond the harsh surface to the hidden life beneath. She banked the stove fire and prepared for bed, already planning what supplies to request in town. But more than that, she found herself looking forward to the journey itself, hours in Clay's company, a chance to see beyond the ranch's boundaries, and maybe, just maybe, an opportunity to understand the complicated man who'd hired her to be a shadow, but was slowly allowing her to become something more substantial. The desert wind whispered around the house, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Violet smiled as she pulled her blankets up. She was adjusting. Yes, but more than that, she was beginning to feel something she hadn't expected, the first stirrings of belonging. The morning of the town trip dawned clear and promising. Violet had been ready since before sunrise, wearing her most modest dress with long sleeves as Clay had suggested. She'd packed a small basket with water and food for the journey, unsure what to expect from the long ride. Clay seemed different that morning, less guarded, though still quiet. He helped her into the wagon without comment, his hands steady and impersonal at her waist. As they set off, the desert stretched before them in shades of gold and rust, the mountains standing like ancient sentinels in the distance. They'd been traveling for 2 hours, the rhythm of the horses' hooves almost hypnotic, when it happened. Violet had climbed down during a rest stop to stretch her legs and gather some interesting rocks she'd spotted near a cluster of sagebrush. She was reaching for a particularly pretty piece of rose quartz when she felt the sharp, burning pain in her ankle. The rattlesnake was already retreating, its warning rattle filling the air too late. Violet stumbled backward, her vision blurring as she saw the 2 puncture marks already beginning to swell. "Clay!" she managed to call out, her voice thin with shock and growing fear. He was beside her in an instant, his face draining of color when he saw the bite marks. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms and carried her to a flat rock in the shade of the wagon. "Don't move," he commanded, pulling a knife from his belt. "This will hurt." He was efficient and careful, making small cuts across the puncture marks. Then, to her shock, he bent his head and began drawing out the venom with his mouth, spitting it aside repeatedly. His hands were steady, but she could feel the tension in them as he worked. "You shouldn't," she whispered, remembering vaguely that sucking venom was dangerous for the person doing it. "Quiet," he said roughly, continuing his work. When he'd done all he could, he tore strips from his shirt to bind the wound tightly. "We're going back, now." The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare blur. Clay pushed the horses harder than was safe, one arm around Violet to keep her steady as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she was dimly aware of Clay shading her face with his hat, of his voice talking constantly about the ranch, about his horses, about anything to keep her conscious. "My mother knew about snake bites," she heard him say, "knew which herbs to use, how to draw the poison out. She tried to teach me, but I was too stubborn, too proud to learn Apache ways properly. Don't you dare leave before I can remember what she taught me." By the time they reached the ranch, Violet was burning with fever. Clay carried her inside, placing her gently on her bed before racing out again. She heard him moving around outside, the sound of digging, of fire being built. Then he was back with a bowl of something that smelled sharp and medicinal. "Drink this," he ordered, supporting her head. The liquid was bitter beyond description, but she forced it down. He bathed her face with cool water, applied poultices to the snake bite, never leaving her side. Night fell, and the fever grew worse. Violet tossed restlessly, caught in dreams where snakes made of fire chased her through endless desert. Sometimes she surfaced enough to see Clay's face above her, lined with worry, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. "Please," she heard him whisper in one of her clearer moments. "I've lost too much already. Don't leave. You fight fire like no one I've known." She wanted to answer, to tell him she was trying, but the fever pulled her under again. In her delirium, she thought she felt his hand smoothing her hair, thought she heard him singing something low and rhythmic in a language she didn't understand. The crisis came near dawn. Violet's breathing grew shallow, her skin clammy despite the fever. Clay gathered her against him, his voice breaking as he spoke. "You came here to live, not just survive. You told me that in the storm. Remember? So live. Violet, live." Whether it was his words, the medicine, or pure stubborn will, something shifted. The fever broke in a rush of sweat, leaving her weak but lucid. She opened her eyes to find Clay holding her, his face haggard with exhaustion and something else, something that looked like fear. "Clay?" Her voice was barely a whisper. The relief that washed over his features was profound. He eased her back onto the pillows, his hands infinitely gentle. "You're awake? Good. That's good." She managed a weak smile. "Did you just admit to being glad I'm alive?" "Don't get used to it," he said, but there was no bite to the words. He turned to pour water from the pitcher, giving her small sips. "You need to rest. The worst is over. But snake bites, they take time to heal." Violet slept then, a healing sleep without dreams. When she woke, it was afternoon, golden light slanting through the window. Clay was asleep in the chair beside her bed, slumped forward with his head resting on his folded arms. He looked younger in sleep, The harsh lines of his face softened. She studied him, this complicated man who'd sucked poison from her veins, who'd spent the night fighting for her life with remedies his Apache mother had taught him. His shirt was still torn from making bandages, and she could see bruises on his arms from carrying her, as if sensing her gaze. He stirred and lifted his head. Their eyes met and held, a long moment of silence that said more than words could express. "How do you feel?" he asked finally. "Alive," she said. "Thanks to you." He shook his head. "I should have warned you better. Should have been watching." "Clay!" She reached out weakly, and after a hesitation, he took her hand. "You saved my life." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, the lightest touch. "You scared me," he admitted quietly. "When I saw that snake, saw the bite, I thought, but I'm here." "Yes." His voice was rough. "You're here." A knock at the door broke the moment. Clay released her hand and went to answer it. Violet heard voices. He must have sent word to town for the doctor, but she found herself missing the quiet intimacy of the moment before. The first time she'd seen past all of Clay's walls to the man underneath. The doctor, a brusque older man named Dr. Henshaw, examined her thoroughly. "You're lucky," he pronounced. "Without quick treatment, rattlesnake bites can be fatal, mister. Yazzie did everything right." "He's had good teachers," Violet said, catching Clay's eye. Something passed between them, an understanding that hadn't existed before. The doctor left instructions for care and medicines, promising to check back in a few days. After he left, Clay helped Violet sit up, propping pillows behind her. "You'll need to stay in bed for at least a week," he said. "I'll manage the cooking." The thought of Clay attempting to cook in her carefully organized kitchen made her smile despite her weakness. "I could talk you through some simple things." "Maybe." He stood awkwardly, as if unsure what to do now that the immediate crisis had passed. "You should rest." "Clay," she called as he reached the door. "Thank you for everything." He paused, his back to her. "I'm not a good man. Violet, you should know that." "I've never asked you to be," she replied, echoing her words from the storm. "But you're the man who saved my life. That's enough for me." He left without responding, but Violet thought she saw his shoulders relax slightly as he walked away. The next few days passed in a blur of sleeping and waking. True to his word, Clay attempted cooking, with mixed results. His beans were either undercooked or mush. His biscuits could have been used as weapons, but he tried. More importantly, he stayed close, checking on her frequently, helping her when she needed it without making her feel helpless. On the fourth day, Violet felt strong enough to sit in the kitchen while Clay attempted soup. She guided him through the process, trying not to laugh as he muttered Apache curses at the rebellious vegetables. "Your mother," she ventured carefully. "You said she knew about healing." Clay's hands stilled on the knife he was using. "She knew many things. The desert was her home long before it was mine." "Will you tell me about her?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. His mother had been barely 16 when she was taken in a raid, sold to a white trader who used her badly before a rancher named Yazzie bought her, claiming he needed a cook. But James Yazzie had been kind in his way, and when Clay was born, he'd acknowledged him, given him his name. "She tried to teach me the old ways," Clay said, stirring the soup with unnecessary force. "But I was stubborn, wanted to be white, thought it would be easier. Fool boy." "You remembered when it mattered," Violet said softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her. "She would have liked you. Said once that the strongest women were like desert flowers. They bloomed where nothing else could survive." It was the longest speech she'd ever heard from him, and the most revealing. Violet felt the weight of his trust, knowing how much it cost him to share even this much. That evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of fire, they sat together on the porch. Violet was wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth, still weak but healing. Clay had brought his harmonica but hadn't played yet, just held it in his hands. "I was married before," Violet found herself saying. "In Boston. His name was Thomas." Clay didn't speak, but she felt his attention sharpen. He was charming at first, said all the right things, but he loved cards more than anything else. The debts grew, and when the money ran out, she touched her side absently, remembering old bruises. "He died in a fight over a poker game, left me with nothing but bills and a reputation." "Is that why you came west?" "Partly, but mostly." She looked out at the vast desert, the endless sky. "I wanted to find out if I could be more than what I'd been made into, if I could bloom where nothing else survived." Clay was quiet for a long moment. Then he lifted the harmonica to his lips and began to play, a lonely, beautiful melody that seemed to capture everything about this hard land and the people who chose to live in it. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Violet felt something settle in her chest. The snake bite would heal, leaving only a scar. But something else had been born in those fever-racked hours, a connection forged in crisis, sealed in trust, and now growing in the space between two people who'd thought themselves too damaged for anything but survival. When the music finally faded, Clay stood and helped her to her feet. At her bedroom door, he hesitated. "I'm not good at this," he said quietly. "At people, at caring." "I don't need you to be good at it," Violet replied. "Just willing to try." He nodded slowly, then did something that surprised them both. He touched her cheek, just briefly, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Sleep well, Violet." As she lay in bed listening to the familiar night sounds of the desert, Violet touched the place where his hand had been. The snake bite throbbed dully, a reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. But she was alive. And Clay Yazzie, the man who'd wanted only a shadow, had fought to keep her that way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The town still needed visiting. Supplies still needed buying. And there was the harvest to think about. But tonight, Violet allowed herself to hope that she'd found more than just employment in this harsh land. She'd found a place where she could bloom. 2 weeks after the snake bite, Violet finally felt strong enough for the postponed trip to Willow Creek. The morning was cooler than usual, with clouds gathering on the horizon promising the possibility of rain, a rarity in the desert that had both of them glancing skyward with hope. Clay helped her into the wagon with a carefulness that had become natural between them since her illness. His hands lingered just a moment at her waist, and she caught him checking the ground around the wagon for snakes before climbing up beside her. The ride to town was different this time. Clay pointed out landmarks, told her which plants were edible, which rocks indicated water might be near. It was the most he'd ever spoken at once, and Violet treasured each word, filing the knowledge away. "See that outcropping?" He gestured to a formation of red rocks. "Apache lookout point. My mother's people would watch for cavalry from there." "Do you ever visit them? Your mother's people?" Clay's jaw tightened slightly. "They want nothing to do with a half-blood who chose the white world, and the whites." He shrugged. "You'll see soon enough." Willow Creek appeared like a mirage where the desert gave way to a small river valley. The town wasn't much. A main street with a general store, saloon, hotel, and a few other businesses. Houses scattered beyond, like seeds blown by the wind. But after weeks of isolation, it seemed almost overwhelming. Clay pulled the wagon up outside Hartman's general store. "Stay close," he said quietly. "Don't wander off alone." The moment they entered the store, Violet understood his warning. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Every eye turned to them, and the expressions ranged from curiosity to open hostility. A woman near the fabric counter pulled her daughter closer, whispering something that made the child stare. Clay moved through the store as if he didn't notice, selecting supplies with efficient movements. Violet followed, trying to ignore the weight of the stairs. She paused at the fabric counter, running her fingers over a bolt of blue cotton that would make good curtains. "That's not for sale." The woman behind the counter spoke coldly, looking past Violet to Clay. "Not to his kind." Heat flooded Violet's cheeks. I beg your pardon? You heard me? The woman's eyes were hard as flint. We don't need your type here, bringing down the town's reputation. Before Violet could respond, a man emerged from the back room. He was tall and well-dressed, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Violet recognized the type immediately. Thomas had worn the same smile when he'd been planning something cruel. Now, Mrs. Paulson, there's no need for rudeness. The man's voice was smooth as oil. I'm Harold Spencer, owner of the Double S Ranch, and you must be the housekeeper we've heard so much about. He said housekeeper the way someone might say a particularly foul word. Violet lifted her chin. I'm Mrs. Bennett. Yes, I work for Mr. Yazzie. Work. Spencer's smile widened. Is that what they're calling it these days? Clay appeared at Violet's side, his presence solid and dangerous. You have something to say, Spencer? Just making conversation with your employee. Spencer's eyes traveled over Violet in a way that made her skin crawl. A woman like this, from back east, choosing to live with a half-breed, makes a man wonder what kind of woman she really is. The kind who can cook and keep house, Violet said firmly. Which is all that should concern anyone. Feisty. Spencer chuckled. I can see why he keeps you around. Tell me, Mrs. Bennett, when you tire of playing in the dirt with savages, the Double S could use a woman of your talents. Clay stepped forward, his hand moving to his hip where a gun normally rested. He wasn't armed. Town ordinance. But the gesture was clear. We're done here. For now. Spencer agreed amiably. But this conversation isn't over. You've pushed boundaries before. Yazzie. But bringing her here, that's a step too far. The good people of Willow Creek have standards. They left without buying anything, Clay's face carved from stone. He helped Violet into the wagon with barely controlled anger, his hands shaking slightly. They were almost out of town when he pulled the horses to a stop beside a smaller, shabbier building marked Chung's Goods. Wait here, he said curtly, but Violet climbed down after him. I'm not hiding in the wagon like a shameful secret. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. The store was run by an elderly Chinese man who greeted Clay with genuine warmth. Mr. Clay, long time. And this must be the lady you mentioned. His smile was kind as he looked at Violet. Welcome, welcome. They were able to buy everything they needed there, though the selection was smaller. Mr. Chung even had the blue fabric Violet had admired, selling it to her at a fair price. As they loaded the wagon, he pressed a small bag of tea into Violet's hands. For strength, he said quietly. This town, it can be hard on those who don't fit their narrow ideas. The ride back began in heavy silence. Clay's knuckles were white on the reins. His jaw clenched so tight Violet worried he'd break teeth. Finally, as the town disappeared behind them, he spoke. I shouldn't have taken you there. Should have known better. Stop. Violet's voice was firm. You warned me it would be difficult. I chose to come anyway. You don't understand. Spencer, he owns half the valley. When he decides someone doesn't belong. Clay shook his head. I've brought trouble to your door. My door? Violet laughed, surprising them both. Clay Yazzie, in case you've forgotten, I came to your door, of my own free will. He glanced at her, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. Why did you, really? You could have found work in a dozen places between Boston and here. Violet considered the question, watching a hawk circle overhead. Because your advertisement was the only one that didn't promise anything it couldn't deliver. No talk of romance or building a future together. Just work for pay. It was honest. And now, after seeing how it is, now I know why you wanted a shadow instead of a person. It would be easier, wouldn't it? To not care what they think. Clay was quiet for a long moment. Yes, but I'm not a shadow. And you knew that the night you saved my life. Probably knew it before then. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the same outcropping he'd pointed out earlier. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the rocks in shades of fire. That first night, he admitted quietly. When you stood in my kitchen, tired and afraid but still standing straight, I knew then you were trouble. Good trouble or bad trouble? He turned to look at her fully. The setting sun caught the lighter flecks in his sage-green eyes, turned his bronze skin to gold. I don't know yet. The honesty of it made her breath catch. They sat there in the wagon, the desert spreading endless around them. Two people caught between worlds that didn't want them. And then, as if drawn by some force neither could name, they moved closer. The kiss was inevitable, as sunrise, slow, careful, with all the weight of their damaged hearts behind it. Clay's hand cupped her cheek, work roughened but gentle. Violet's fingers curled into his shirt, anchoring herself as the world tilted. When they parted, both breathing unsteadily, Clay rested his forehead against hers. "This is dangerous," he whispered. "Spencer wasn't making idle threats. I'm not afraid of Harold Spencer. You should be. Men like him. They take what they want and destroy what they can't have." Violet pulled back to meet his eyes. "Then we'll face him together. Unless you want me to leave." "No." The word came out harsh, immediate. Clay caught himself, softened his tone. "No, I don't want you to leave. God help me, I should. But, he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture achingly tender. "But you've already grown roots in this desert, and I'm selfish enough to want to see what blooms." They returned home as darkness fell, the wagon loaded with supplies and something more, an understanding that whatever lay between them was no longer just about cooking and housekeeping. As they unpacked by lamplight, their hands would brush, their eyes would meet, and the very air seemed charged with possibility. That night, Clay brought his supper to the kitchen table without being asked. They ate in comfortable silence, but it was different now, weighted with promise and threat in equal measure. When Violet stood to clear the dishes, Clay caught her hand. "Spencer will make trouble," he said. "He'll try to drive you away, make life hard enough that you'll leave on your own." "Let him try." Violet squeezed his fingers. "I've survived worse than small-minded men with too much power." Clay studied her face in the lamplight. "You remind me of the desert after rain," he said finally. "Everything hidden suddenly blooming, impossible to ignore." It was probably the most poetic thing he'd ever said, and Violet felt her heart turn over. She leaned down and kissed him again, brief but sure. "Then let me bloom, Clay. Whatever comes, let me bloom." After she went to bed, Clay sat alone on the porch, playing his harmonica so softly it was almost lost in the night wind. The melody was different now, less lonely, more complex. Hope and fear twisted together like the smoke from his cigarette. In town, Harold Spencer was probably making plans, stirring up the fear that kept the valley in line. There would be consequences for today's defiance. Clay knew men like Spencer didn't tolerate resistance, especially from those they considered beneath them. But inside the house, Violet was humming as she prepared for bed, her voice carrying through the thin walls. She'd stood beside him in that store, faced down Spencer's contempt without flinching. She'd kissed him as the sun set, knowing full well what it meant. For the first time in his life, Clay Yazzie had something worth protecting besides just land and cattle. It terrified him more than any rattlesnake or sandstorm ever could. But as her humming faded into sleep-quiet breathing, he found himself planning not for retreat, but for defense. Let Spencer come. Clay had survived worse storms, and now he had a reason to do more than just survive. He had someone who saw him not as a half-blood or a savage, but as a man worth kissing under the desert sunset. That was worth any fight Spencer could bring. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human troubles, but Clay felt their light differently now. Not cold and distant, but constant, like the woman sleeping inside his house, the woman who'd chosen to bloom in his desert despite all the reasons she shouldn't. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Tonight, for the first time in memory, Clay Yazzie allowed himself to hope. The morning after their trip to town dawned with an unusual chill. Clay woke early, as always, but found himself lingering over coffee, watching Violet move about the kitchen with new eyes. Everything had shifted with that sunset kiss, and he felt raw, exposed, like a man who'd stepped out of a cave into blinding light. "You're staring," Violet said without turning from the stove. "Am I?" He took another sip of coffee to hide his discomfort. "Just thinking. Dangerous habit." She set a plate before him. Eggs, biscuits, bacon crisp the way he liked it. Her hand brushed his shoulder as she passed, and he caught her fingers briefly, pressing them before letting go. They were learning this new dance, step by careful step. The peace lasted 3 days. Clay should have known it wouldn't hold. Peace never did in his experience. He was mending fence in the far pasture when he saw the dust cloud approaching. Riders, moving fast. He mounted his horse and headed back, arriving at the house just as Harold Spencer and 4 of his men were dismounting in the yard. Violet stood on the porch, broom in hand like a weapon, chin raised despite being vastly outnumbered. Clay felt a surge of pride and fear in equal measure. "Spencer!" He positioned his horse between the men and the house. "You're on my land. Just paying a neighborly visit." Spencer's smile was all teeth. "Wanted to make sure your housekeeper understood how things work around here." "I believe I understood perfectly well in town," Violet said coolly. "You made your position quite clear." Spencer chuckled. "Brave little thing, isn't she? Tell me, Yazzie, where'd you really find her? What kind of woman chooses to live out here with a half-breed?" Clay's hand moved to his gun, but Spencer's men were faster, hands on their own weapons. The message was clear. Make a move and die. I'll tell you what kind. Spencer continued, enjoying himself. The kind who's already fallen so low she's got nowhere else to go. What was it, sweetheart? Husband leave you, or maybe you never had one. Maybe that widow's dress is just for show. "My husband is dead," Violet said steadily. "And I'm here because Mr. Yazzie pays fair wages for honest work." "Honest work?" Spencer laughed. "And his men joined in. Is that what you call it? I've got a better offer. Come work at the Double S. I'll pay you triple whatever he is. You'll have a real room, not some shack. And you won't have to pretend it's just about cooking." Clay dismounted slowly, deliberately. "Get off my land." "Or what? You'll scalp me?" Spencer's eyes glittered with malice. "Your mother's people tried that with my father. Didn't work out too well for them. Did it?" Something snapped in Clay's carefully maintained control. He lunged at Spencer, catching him off guard, driving him into the dirt. They rolled, trading blows, while Spencer's men shouted and drew their guns. "Stop!" Violet's voice cracked like a whip. She'd grabbed Clay's rifle from inside the door, had it trained on the nearest of Spencer's men. "Everyone stop, or I start shooting!" The yard fell silent except for Clay and Spencer's harsh breathing. Clay had Spencer pinned, fist raised, while Spencer's split lip bled into the dust. "Let him up, Clay," Violet said calmly. "Mister, Spencer was just leaving." Clay released him reluctantly, standing with the fists still clenched. Spencer got to his feet, dusting off his clothes with shaking hands. His carefully maintained composure was cracked, revealing the ugly fury beneath. "You've made a mistake," he said, voice low and dangerous. "Both of you. This valley has no place for a savage and his woman. I'll make sure of that." "Then you'll have to make sure from a distance," Violet said, "because if you set foot on this property again, I'll shoot you myself. And unlike Clay, I won't hesitate because of some misguided sense of frontier honor." Spencer stared at her, perhaps truly seeing her for the first time. Whatever he saw made him step back. "This isn't over," he promised, then mounted his horse. His men followed, casting dark looks back as they rode away. Clay stood frozen in the yard, chest heaving, knuckles bloody. Violet set the rifle down carefully and approached him. "Let me see your hands." "I'm fine." "You're not?" She took his hands anyway, examining the split skin. "Come inside. Those cuts need cleaning." He followed her numbly into the kitchen, sinking into a chair while she fetched water and clean cloth. As she worked on his hands, he finally spoke. I lost control. I shouldn't have. He insulted me. He insulted your mother. You defended us both and made things worse. Clay winced as she cleaned a particularly deep cut. He'll retaliate now. His pride won't let this stand. Then we'll be ready. Violet tied off the bandage with efficient movements. I meant what I said. I'll shoot him if he comes back. Clay caught her hands, stilling them. This is what I was afraid of. What I tried to avoid by keeping distance between us. You're in danger now because of what I feel. Because of what we are to each other? Violet finished gently. Clay, I was in danger the moment I stepped off that train. A woman alone, working for a man the town despises. Spencer would have come for me eventually, regardless of what's between us. She was right, and he knew it. But knowing didn't ease the fear that sat cold in his belly. If something happens to you because of me, nothing will happen to me. She cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. I've survived worse than Harold Spencer, and I didn't survive just to cower now. That night, Clay moved his bedroll to the main room, rifle close at hand. Violet protested, but he was adamant. Just until we know what Spencer's planning. They fell into a new routine over the following days. Clay stayed closer to the house, working on projects that kept him within sight of the windows. Violet kept the rifle by the door and practiced loading it until her movements were smooth and sure. They were under siege, though no enemy appeared. The attack, when it came, wasn't what they expected. Violet woke to the smell of smoke. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and saw the orange glow through her window. The barn was on fire. Clay! She ran to the main room, but he was already up, pulling on boots and grabbing buckets. Stay in the house, he ordered, but she was right behind him as he ran outside. The barn was fully engulfed, flames licking at the sky. The horses were screaming, trapped inside. Without thinking, Clay plunged toward the barn doors. No! Violet grabbed his arm. You'll die! He shook her off, but she held tight. The horses are not worth your life! She pulled him back with strength born of desperation. Clay, please! They could only watch as the barn collapsed, the awful sounds of the horses mercifully ending. Clay fell to his knees, and Violet knelt beside him, arms around his shoulders as he shook with rage and grief. Storm and thunder, he whispered. My mother named them. They were all I had left of. I know, Violet murmured. I know. I'm so sorry. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, they found the evidence boot prints, the smell of kerosene. Spencer's men had been careful, but not careful enough. We should go to the sheriff, Violet said. Clay laughed bitterly. The sheriff's Spencer's cousin. There's no law here for people like us. Then what do we do? He stood slowly, face carved from granite. I don't know, but I won't let him drive us out, not from land I've bled for. That evening, as they sat exhausted and covered in soot from trying to salvage what they could, Violet made a decision. I'm not leaving. Clay, whatever you're thinking, whatever noble sacrifice you're planning, forget it. I'm not leaving. Violet, no. She moved closer, taking his bandaged hands in hers. You asked me once what kind of woman I am. I'll tell you. I'm the kind who doesn't run. Not anymore. I ran from Boston, from my old life, but I'm done running. This is my home now. You are my home. Clay pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair. I don't deserve you. Stop saying that. She pulled back to look at him. You deserve everything. Clay Yazzie, love, happiness, peace. And if I have to fight Harold Spencer and the whole town to give it to you, I will. He kissed her then, desperate and deep, tasting of smoke and sorrow and fierce determination. When they broke apart, something had solidified between them, forged in fire like steel. Together then, he said. Whatever comes. Together, she agreed. They spent the night making plans, sitting close at the kitchen table. Clay sketched maps, showing her the hidden trails his mother had taught him, the places to run if things went bad. Violet made lists of supplies they'd need, ways to defend the house. They were preparing for war. but there was strange comfort in doing it side by side. As the first light of dawn touched the sky, Clay surprised them both by speaking of the future, not the immediate danger, but beyond it. "When this is over," he said quietly, "when Spencer's dealt with one way or another, would you stay, not as a housekeeper, as your wife?" Violet's heart skipped. "Clay Yazzie, are you proposing?" He flushed but held her gaze. "I'm asking if you'd consider it. A half-blood with nothing but land and stubbornness to offer. Not much of a bargain." "I'd consider it," she said softly. "I'd more than consider it." They sealed that promise with a kiss as the sun rose over the desert, painting the world in shades of hope despite the ashes of the barn still smoldering in the yard. Spencer had struck first blood, but he'd also done something else. He'd united them completely, burning away any last hesitation or doubt. The war for their right to exist in this valley had begun, but Clay and Violet would face it as they'd learned to face everything else, together, with the fierce love of desert survivors who'd found in each other the strength to bloom despite every odd against them. The isolation began gradually. Then, all at once, first, the general store in Willow Creek refused Clay's money. "Orders from Mr. Spencer," the clerk said, not meeting his eyes. "Can't sell to you or anyone associated with your household." Then the mill stopped buying their grain. The blacksmith wouldn't shoe their remaining horses. Even Dr. Henshaw sent word that he could no longer make house calls to the Yazzie ranch. "They're trying to starve us out," Violet said, counting their dwindling supplies. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting shadows that seemed deeper than before. "We can hunt," Clay said. "There's game in the mountains, and Chung might still trade with us." But when they made the long ride to Chung's store, they found windows boarded and a sign, "Closed by order of the town council." The old man's house behind the store was empty, his few possessions gone. "Spencer's reach is longer than I thought," Clay said grimly. They survived on what they could hunt and what grew wild. Violet learned to make flour from mesquite pods, to find water where none seemed to exist. But as the weeks passed, the strain showed. They were thinner, harder, like the desert itself had carved away everything soft. Then came the morning Violet felt dizzy drawing water from the well. The bucket slipped from her hands, crashing back down. Clay found her clutching the edge of the well, face gray with nausea. "Just tired," she insisted. But when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. Clay carried her inside, fear cold in his chest. She'd been tired lately, eating less, though she tried to hide it. Now, as he held a cup of water to her lips, his hands shook. "We need a doctor," he said. "The nearest one who'll see us is in Tucson. 2 days' ride. Then we'll go to Tucson." But that night, Violet woke gasping for air, clutching her throat. The water cup beside her bed had a strange smell, bitter, chemical. Clay grabbed it, sniffed, and his blood ran cold. "Poison," he whispered. "The well! They poisoned the well!" They had no choice but to use their last water sparingly, boiling it and hoping that would help. But Violet grew worse, fevered and weak. Clay held her through the long night, feeling more helpless than he'd ever been. By morning, she was barely conscious. Clay made his decision. He saddled their strongest horse, wrapped Violet in blankets, and held her in front of him as they rode hard for town. Not to beg Spencer's doctors for help. He knew better. But there was one person who might still have conscience enough to act. Father Miguel at the Catholic mission had always been kind, even to Clay. He found the priest tending his small garden and nearly fell from the horse in his urgency. "Please," Clay begged. "She's dying. They poisoned our well. I know I'm not welcome, but she's innocent in this. Please." Father Miguel took one look at Violet's gray face and acted without hesitation. "Bring her inside. Quickly!" The priest had some medical knowledge and, more importantly, clean water and basic medicines, as he worked over Violet, forcing charcoal water between her lips to absorb the poison. Clay paced the small room like a caged animal. "Who did this?" Father Miguel asked. "You know who." Clay's voice was flat. "The same man who runs this valley like his personal kingdom. I cannot believe Harold would believe it. Clay turned fierce eyes on the priest. He burns barns with horses inside. He drives out anyone who helps us, and now he's poisoned our water because we won't bow to him. Father Miguel crossed himself. This is evil. This goes beyond prejudice into mortal sin. It took hours before Violet's breathing eased, before color returned to her face, when she finally opened her eyes, focusing on Clay's face. He nearly wept with relief. You're safe, he told her. We're at the mission. Father Miguel helped you. The well, she whispered. Poisoned. We can't go back, not until... Until what? Father Miguel asked. Until Spencer decides you've suffered enough, he won't stop. Clay, not until you're dead or gone. Clay knew the priest was right. That night, as Violet slept, he made his choice. He slipped out of the mission and rode through darkness to the Double S Ranch. The big house blazed with light. Spencer was hosting one of his gatherings, the sound of laughter and music drifting on the night air. Clay didn't go to the house. Instead, he went to the stables, to the hay stored for winter. It was a dry year. The hay would burn fast and hot. He worked quietly, efficiently, just as Spencer's men had done at his barn. The fire started small, then exploded outward. Horses screamed, but Clay had opened their stall doors first, giving them a chance Spencer hadn't given his. Men poured from the house, shouting, forming bucket brigades. But it was too late. The stables, the hay stores, part of the main house, all consumed by flames that lit the night sky for miles. Clay watched from a distant ridge, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret. It was justice. Nothing more. Let Spencer know how it felt to see everything burn. He returned to the mission before dawn, slipping back to Violet's side. She woke as he settled beside her, and he saw in her eyes that she knew what he'd done. The smoke, she whispered. I can smell it on you. It's finished. He said simply, No. She touched his face. It's just beginning. He'll come for us now. She was right. By noon, Sheriff Watson arrived at the mission with a warrant for Clay's arrest. Father Miguel tried to intervene, but Watson brushed him aside. Arson's a hanging offense, the sheriff said with satisfaction. Though Spencer's willing to be merciful, leave the territory, both of you, and charges might be forgotten. And if we don't? Violet asked. She was sitting up now, still weak but fierce. Then your man hangs, and you... Watson's smile was ugly. Well, a woman alone in these parts. Anything could happen. Father Miguel stepped forward. This is a house of God. You will not threaten. I'll do whatever Spencer tells me to do, Watson said flatly. You've got one day to decide. After he left, they sat in silence. The choice seemed obvious. Leave, live, start over somewhere else. But Clay looked at Violet and saw the same stubborn refusal in her eyes that he felt in his heart. I won't run, she said. Not for men like him. You could die. I nearly did anyway. At least if we stay and fight, it means something. Father Miguel cleared his throat. There might be another way. The territorial judge rides circuit. He'll be in Prescott next week. If you could get there, present your case. Judge Harper is known to be fair, even to Indians and their allies. Prescott's 3 days' ride. Clay said, Spencer would never let us get that far. Not if you took the main roads. The priest agreed. But there are other ways, old paths the Apache used. I could draw you a map. Hope flickered, fragile but real. They spent the night planning, gathering what supplies Father Miguel could spare. At dawn, they slipped away from the mission, taking paths that wound through canyons and over ridges where no wagon could follow. The journey was grueling. Violet was still weak from the poison, and they had to stop frequently. They slept hidden in caves and arroyos, always watching for pursuit. On the second night, they heard horses in the distance and pressed deep into a crevice, hardly breathing until the sounds faded. On the third day, exhausted and running low on water, they saw Prescott rising from the valley ahead, but as they approached the outskirts, riders appeared. Spencer's men, who'd guessed their destination and ridden hard to intercept them. Going somewhere? It was the same man who'd leered at Violet that day at the ranch. "Mr. Spencer wants a word." Clay counted 5 men, all armed. His hand moved to his gun, but Violet caught his wrist. "Wait," she whispered. Then, louder, "We're going to see the judge. You can't stop us from seeking legal recourse." The man laughed. "Legal? You think the law matters out here? Only law is what Mr. Spencer says." His words cut off as a new voice interrupted. "That's enough, Jenkins." A man emerged from the shadow of a building, tall, weathered, wearing a badge that caught the light. Federal Marshal Thompson. And from what I just heard, Mr. Spencer's been making his own law for too long. The riders shifted uneasily. Federal marshals had authority even Spencer couldn't ignore. "We ain't done nothing wrong, Marshal," Jenkins protested. "Just talking to these folks." "With 5 armed men, sounds more like intimidation to me." Thompson's hand rested casually on his gun. "How about you boys head on back to the Double S? Tell Spencer the federal government's taking an interest in his valley." They had no choice but to comply, casting dark looks as they rode away. Thompson turned to Clay and Violet. "Father Miguel sent word," he explained. "Thought you might need help reaching the judge. Come on, let's get you folks somewhere safe." As they followed the marshal into town, Violet leaned against Clay, exhausted but victorious. They'd made it to Prescott. They'd have their day in court. It wasn't over. Spencer would fight back, use every dirty trick he knew. But for the first time since the barn burned, they had hope. "Thank you," Clay said quietly to the marshal. Thompson shrugged. "Don't thank me yet. Spencer's got money and influence. But the judge, well, Judge Harper lost his own son to a lynch mob that thought the law didn't apply to them. He takes a dim view of men who think they're above justice." That night, in a boarding house under federal protection, Clay and Violet finally allowed themselves to believe they might win. The trial would be hard, the outcome uncertain, but they'd face down poison and fire and threats. Whatever came next, they'd face it as they'd learned to face everything, together, unbroken, refusing to be driven from the land they'd claimed with sweat and blood and love. The courthouse in Prescott was a modest wooden building that smelled of ink and old paper. Judge Harper, a stern man with grief-lined eyes, listened as the prosecutor, paid for by Spencer, laid out the charges against Clay: arson, destruction of property, attempted murder, since men had been in the burning buildings. "Your Honor," the prosecutor concluded, "this half-breed savage showed his true nature, bringing violence and lawlessness to a peaceful community." When it came time for the defense, Violet stood. She'd insisted on speaking, despite Clay's protests and the prosecutor's objections. "Your Honor," she began, voice clear despite her trembling hands, "I need to tell you about systematic persecution, about poisoned wells and burned barns, about a man who believes his wealth puts him above the law." She told it all, the threats, the isolation, the horses burned alive, the poison that nearly killed her. Her voice broke when she spoke of holding Clay as he wept for his horses, of the nights they'd gone hungry because no one would sell to them. "Clay Yazzie isn't the criminal here," she finished. "He's a man pushed past endurance, defending the woman he—" She looked at Clay, tears streaming down her face. "The woman he loves. The only crime in that courtroom is Harold Spencer's certainty that justice doesn't apply to him." Spencer himself sat in the gallery, face purple with rage, when he tried to interrupt. Judge Harper's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Spencer." The trial lasted 3 days. Witnesses were called, some too frightened of Spencer to speak truth, others finding courage in the federal presence. Father Miguel testified about the poisoned well, producing a sample he'd saved. The Chinese merchant Chung, who'd been run out of town, returned to describe Spencer's business practices. On the final day, Clay himself took the stand. The prosecutor tried to paint him as a violent savage, bringing up his Apache blood repeatedly until Judge Harper warned him about inflammatory language irrelevant to the case. "Mr. Yazzie," the judge asked directly, Did you set fire to the Double S Ranch? Clay met his gaze steadily. I did. Gasps filled the courtroom. Violet closed her eyes, fearing all was lost. Why? The judge continued. Because they burned my barn with horses inside. Because they poisoned our well. Because the law in Willow Creek belongs to Spencer, and I had no other recourse. Clay's voice remained calm. I opened the stable doors first. I gave his horses the chance he didn't give mine. If that makes me a criminal, so be it. But I won't apologize for defending my home and the woman I love. Judge Harper was quiet for a long moment. Then, Mr. Spencer, take the stand. Spencer strutted forward, confident in his power. But under the judge's questioning, his composure cracked. He denied everything, but his anger made him careless. He let slip details only someone involved could know. When confronted with Father Miguel's evidence of poison, he blustered about protecting the community from undesirable elements. Undesirable elements, Judge Harper repeated slowly. Like a war widow trying to make an honest living. Like a man whose only crime seems to be his mixed heritage. They don't belong, Spencer snapped. This is a white community, a Christian community. We have standards. The only standard I see, the judge interrupted, is that you believe your money puts you above the law. Sheriff Watson, please take the stand. The sheriff, sweating profusely, tried to maintain Spencer's version of events, but Marshal Thompson had done his own investigation, and the evidence was damning. Records of bribes, witnesses to the barn burning, a pattern of harassment dating back years. When all testimony was complete, Judge Harper retired to consider his verdict. The courtroom waited in tense silence. Clay reached for Violet's hand, gripping it tightly. Whatever happens, he whispered, I regret nothing. Nor do I, she whispered back. Judge Harper returned after an hour. His face was grave as he surveyed the courtroom. This case, he began, represents everything wrong with frontier justice. When men like Harold Spencer believe they can create their own law, when they use wealth and influence to persecute those they deem undesirable, they corrupt the very foundation of our society. He looked directly at Spencer. The evidence shows a clear pattern of harassment, assault, and attempted murder by Mr. Spencer and his associates. The poisoning of a well is attempted murder. The burning of an occupied barn is attempted murder. Then he turned to Clay. Mr. Yazzie, you took the law into your own hands. In a civilized society, that cannot be condoned. However, the evidence also shows you were systematically denied access to legal recourse. You acted not out of malice, but out of desperate defense. The judge's gavel came down. Harold Spencer, you are found guilty of conspiracy, attempted murder, and corruption. You will serve 10 years in territorial prison. Your assets will be partially liquidated to pay restitution to Mr. Yazzie and Mrs. Bennett. The courtroom erupted. Spencer lunged forward, screaming threats, and had to be restrained. His men looked lost without their leader's protection. As for you, Mr. Yazzie, the judge continued once order was restored. Given the extreme circumstances and provocation, this court finds you guilty of destruction of property but sentences you to time served and restitution to be paid from Spencer's assets. You're free to go. Violet sobbed with relief, falling into Clay's arms. They held each other as the courtroom cleared, Spencer's threats echoing as he was dragged away. It's over, she whispered. No, Clay said softly. Now it begins. That night, they stayed in the boarding house, trying to process what had happened. Freedom felt strange after months of fear. When Marshal Thompson knocked, they tensed from habit. Relax, he said, entering with a smile. Brought news. Spencer's ranch is in chaos. His men scattered like rats. The territorial government's appointing an administrator for his assets. You'll get fair compensation for your losses. We don't want his money. Clay said, Take it, Thompson advised. You'll need it for what comes next. Willow Creek won't welcome you back with open arms. Spencer had friends. They knew he was right, but as they lay together that night, finally safe, finally free. They found themselves planning not escape, but return. "I want to go home," Violet said against Clay's chest. "To our home." "They won't make it easy." "When has anything in our life been easy?" She lifted her head to look at him. "That's our land. Clay, we bled for it, nearly died for it. I won't let them drive us away." Clay studied her face in the moonlight. This woman who'd arrived expecting to be a shadow had become the fiercest light in his life. "Then we go back, together." "Together," she agreed, sealing it with a kiss that tasted of tears and triumph. 3 days later, they returned to Willow Creek. The town was subdued. Spencer's absence felt like a missing tooth. Some watched their arrival with hostile eyes, but others, those who'd suffered under Spencer's rule, nodded respectfully. At Hartman's general store, Mrs. Paulson stood behind the counter, face pinched with displeasure. But when Clay placed money on the counter, she took it. The law had spoken, and even prejudice bowed to fear of federal marshals. Father Miguel met them at the ranch. He'd organized a group of men, farmers Spencer had cheated, workers he'd abused, to repair what they could. The barn couldn't be rebuilt yet, but the well had been cleaned, tested, declared safe. "It's not forgiveness," one man said quietly. "But Spencer hurt all of us in different ways. Maybe it's time for something better." That night, in their own home, Clay and Violet sat on the porch watching the sun set over the desert. The landscape looked the same. Harsh, unforgiving, beautiful. But something fundamental had changed. "They'll test us," Clay warned. "Spencer's friends, people who think like him, this isn't over." "I know." Violet leaned against his shoulder. "But we're not the same people who met at that train station. We're stronger now. Because of you." Clay said, "You stood in that courtroom and fought for us when I'd given up. You're the bravest person I've ever known." "Not brave," Violet corrected. "Just too stubborn to quit, and too in love to let them win." They sat in comfortable silence as stars emerged in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be those who'd never accept them, who'd make their lives difficult in 1,000 small ways. But there would also be allies. Father Miguel, Marshall Thompson checking in. Neighbors who'd learned that Spencer's way wasn't the only way. "Clay," Violet said softly, "that thing you mentioned before Spencer burned the barn, about after all this was over." He turned to her, sage eyes serious in the fading light. "I meant it, every word. Then ask properly." Clay stood, pulling her up with him, under the vast desert sky. He took her hands. "Violet Bennett, you came here as a housekeeper and became my salvation. Will you marry me, not for convenience or protection, but because I love you more than I ever thought possible?" "Yes," she said simply, tears streaming. "Yes to all of it, to you, to this land, to whatever comes next." They kissed as coyotes called in the distance, as the desert wind whispered through the sage. It wasn't the ending of their story, but a beginning. There would be a wedding. Father Miguel would insist on doing it properly. There would be struggles as they rebuilt what Spencer had destroyed. There would be those who'd never accept a half Apache man and his Eastern bride. But there would also be mornings waking beside each other, evenings on this porch, the satisfaction of making the desert bloom despite those who said it couldn't be done. They would build a life together on this hard land, proving that love could grow even in the most unlikely soil. As they went inside, Clay paused at the door. "No more shadows," he said. "Only light from now on. Only light." Violet agreed, and followed him into their home. The desert settled into night around them, vast and eternal. And in one small ranch house, two people who'd found each other against all odds began the rest of their lives, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as they'd learned to face everything, together, unafraid, and absolutely unbreakable. Years passed like seasons in the desert, some harsh, some gentle, all leaving their mark. Clay and Violet built their life together with the patient determination of people who understood that the best things grew slowly. They raised the barn again, board by board, with help from unexpected allies. Former enemies became, if not friends, then at least respectful neighbors. The world beyond their valley changed too. The railroad pushed further west, bringing new people who didn't carry the old prejudices quite so heavily. Willow Creek grew from a suspicious town into something more complex, more accepting, though the transformation was neither quick nor complete. One autumn morning, a group of settlers arrived at the ranch. They were a mixed bunch: former soldiers, freed slaves, immigrant families, a Chinese couple who'd heard of Clay and Violet's story, all seeking land, all carrying hopes as fragile as desert flowers. "We heard," their spokesman, a weathered black man named Samuel, said carefully, "that this might be a place where folks who don't fit elsewhere could make a start." Clay and Violet exchanged glances. They'd accumulated land over the years. Parcels bought with Spencer's restitution money and their own hard work, more than they could work themselves. "The land out by Apache Ridge," Violet said slowly. "It's rough, but there's water if you know where to look. Clay could show you." And so began something neither had planned. Their ranch became a waypoint for those seeking a different kind of frontier. Clay taught them the desert's secrets: how to read the sky for rain, where to find shade at noon, which plants healed and which harmed. Violet shared her hard-won knowledge of making a home in this unforgiving place, of preserving food, of creating comfort from almost nothing. The children came to her especially. Apache children whose families had made peace with Clay's mixed heritage. Mexican children from the old settlements, the settler children with their wide eyes and endless questions. She taught them all together. Lessons mixing arithmetic with desert survival, reading with the names of plants in 3 languages. "You've become the teacher you never meant to be," Clay said one evening, watching her surrounded by eager young faces. "And you've become the leader you always denied you were," she replied, nodding toward the men gathered near the corral, listening as Clay explained irrigation techniques his mother's people had used for generations. Time weathered them like the desert weathered stone, not weakening but revealing the strength beneath. Clay's hair showed silver at the temples, and lines mapped the corners of Violet's eyes, each one earned through laughter or squinting against the sun. They lost a child to stillbirth one terrible winter, grieved together, and found their love deepened by shared sorrow. They raised 2 others, a daughter with Clay's cheekbones and Violet's stubborn chin, a son with Violet's gentle nature and Clay's way with horses. The ranch grew into something neither had envisioned: part working ranch, part refuge, part symbol that different could also mean strong. Former Sheriff Watson, disgraced after Spencer's trial, came seeking work and forgiveness. They gave him both, watching him transform from bully to protector of the mixed community growing around them. Then came the day a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. Violet was in her expanded garden, teaching a group of women about preserving foods. When she saw the rider approaching, something in her chest tightened with old fear before she recognized the slumped shoulders, the gray beard. Harold Spencer had served his time, emerging from prison aged and broken. His empire was gone, divided among those he'd wronged. He stopped at the gate, looking up at the house he'd once tried to destroy. Clay emerged, rifle in hand but not raised. They stood facing each other, the years between them heavy with memory. "I've got no right to be here," Spencer said, voice cracked as old leather. "Just wanted to see what you built on the ashes I made." "Why?" Violet asked, joining Clay. Spencer looked between them, something flickering in his faded eyes. "Prison gives a man time to think about what matters, what lasts." He gestured weakly at the thriving ranch, the children playing, the mixed group of people working together. "I spent my life trying to keep the world pure, separate. You've made something different." "Different doesn't mean wrong," Clay said quietly. "No," Spencer agreed. "It doesn't." He turned his horse. "I won't trouble you again. Just needed to see." He paused. "I was wrong. About all of it. That won't undo the harm, but I wanted you to know." They watched him ride away, smaller than memory had made him. That night, they held each other a little tighter, marveling at how time could transform even the hardest hearts. More years passed. The territory became a state. The railroad brought tourists who marveled at the authentic frontier experience, not understanding they were witnessing something far more radical, a community built on acceptance rather than exclusion. A young woman from Boston arrived one spring, notebook in hand, seeking stories for a newspaper back east. She'd heard about the ranch, about Clay and Violet, about the mixed community that flourished where only hatred had grown before. "How did you do it?" she asked, pencil poised. "How did you change so much?" Violet smiled, pouring tea in the kitchen where she'd first proved herself with a simple meal. "We didn't set out to change anything. We just wanted to survive, then to live, then to love. The rest," she gestured at the window, where Apache and Mexican and black and white children played together while their parents worked side by side. "The rest grew from that, like flowers after rain. But the obstacles," the reporter pressed, "the prejudice, the violence, were real." Clay said from the doorway, "Some days they still are, but this desert teaches you something. The strongest plants aren't the ones that avoid the harsh conditions. They're the ones that adapt, that sink roots deep, that bloom despite everything telling them they shouldn't." The reporter wrote it all down, but Violet could see she didn't quite understand. How could she? She hadn't held Clay while he grieved his burned horses, hadn't felt poison stealing her breath, hadn't stood in a courtroom fighting for the right to simply exist together. She hadn't watched former enemies become allies, hadn't seen hatred transform to respect through years of patient work. That evening, as the sun set in its eternal glory over the desert, the extended community gathered for their weekly meal. Tables stretched across the yard, laden with foods that told the story of their mixed heritage. Apache fry bread, Mexican beans, Southern cornbread, Chinese dumplings, Violet's Boston brown bread adapted for desert ingredients. "Look at this," Clay murmured to Violet as they surveyed the scene. "Who would have thought?" "You did," she said softly. "The night you saved my life. You told me I fought fire like no one you'd known. You saw something in me I didn't see in myself. And you saw past the half-blood everyone else feared, saw a man worth saving." They stood together, no longer young, but not yet old, weathered by the desert into something enduring. Their daughter Maria was explaining something earnestly to a group of younger children, her hands moving as she talked. Their son James was helping Samuel's boys with a stubborn horse, patient as Clay had taught him to be. "I used to think I'd die here alone," Clay said quietly. "Just another skeleton in the sand." "Instead," Violet prompted, though she knew the answer. "Instead, I lived. We lived. And not just survived, but—" He gestured at the gathering, at the life they'd built from nothing but determination and love. "This," as if hearing their conversation from across the years, the woman from Boston approached. Her notebook was closed now, her city clothes dusty from the desert wind. "I came to write about the dying frontier," she admitted. "But this isn't dying, is it? It's just beginning." "Every day is a beginning," Violet said. "That's what the desert teaches you, that life finds a way, even in the hardest ground." Later, as the stars emerged in their eternal patterns, Clay brought out his harmonica. The melody he played was different now, not lonely but complex, weaving together threads of all the cultures that had found home here. Others joined in with their own instruments, creating something new from the blend of old traditions. Violet leaned against Clay's shoulder, feeling the music vibrate through him. Around them, their extended family, for that's what it had become, talked and laughed and planned for tomorrow. Children sleepy from play curled against their parents. Old enemies sat side by side, sharing stories. "Do you ever regret it?" Clay asked during a pause in the music. "Coming west for a job and getting all this?" Violet laughed, the sound carrying across the desert like bells. "I answered an advertisement for a housekeeper position with a man who wanted a shadow. I found a partner, a love, a life I never dreamed possible. Regret? Not for a single moment. Even the hard parts, the snake bite, the poison, the fire. Especially those, they forged us into who we are. She took his weathered hand in hers. I was half dead in Boston, going through motions. Here, with you, I learned to live. The gathering continued late into the night, as these gatherings always did. Stories were shared, problems discussed, plans made. The community that had grown around them was strong now, self-sufficient, a beacon for others seeking a place to belong. As the evening wound down, the reporter approached one last time. Mrs. Yazzie, one more question. If you could tell your younger self one thing, standing at that train station all those years ago, what would it be? Violet considered, looking at Clay, at their children, at the impossible, beautiful life they'd built. I'd tell her to be brave, that the desert looks harsh but holds miracles, that a man who asks for shadows might be the one to help you shine brightest, that sometimes the best life is the one you never planned for. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to each other, and an owl hunted on silent wings. The desert breathed around them, eternal and ever-changing, harsh and beautiful as the love that had grown between two unlikely people who'd chosen each other against all odds. Ready for bed? Clay asked, standing and offering his hand. Ready for tomorrow, Violet corrected. Taking it, they walked together toward the house they'd made a home, leaving the younger folks to bank the fire and close the evening. Behind them, the community they'd never meant to create continued its quiet revolution, proof that love could bloom in the harshest ground, that differences could be strength, that sometimes the greatest courage was simply refusing to let hate win. The desert stars wheeled overhead, witness to all that had been and all that was still to come. And in a ranch house that had seen tears and laughter, despair and hope, two people who'd saved each other prepared for another day of the life they'd built together. Not perfect, not easy, but absolutely, undeniably, triumphantly theirs. Thank you so much for joining us around the campfire for this Wild West love story. If you're listening to this tale tonight, we'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just like Clay and Violet connected across their differences. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, love, and adventure from the American frontier. What did you think of Clay and Violet's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one and love hearing how these tales of the Old West touch your hearts. Until next time, partners, keep that campfire burning and those stories alive.